Australia's death toll from coronavirus has risen to 11. 2 men in their 70s died in Victoria overnight, and there was a death in Queensland yesterday. The global death toll has broken through 20,000. So in Australia, there are now more than 2,600 confirmed cases of COVID-19. That rate rise is still of deep concern. The National Cabinet has agreed to significantly expand coronavirus testing, but under the new guidelines, some people with symptoms still will not be eligible. Flight Centre has announced it's standing down 3,800 workers in Australia. It's one of the many companies doing so as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. The New South Wales government is blocking all passengers from leaving cruise ships until tough new border protections are put in place. While in WA, Australians will be allowed to disembark from incoming cruise ships, but they'll then be taken to Rottnest Island for 14 days of quarantine. But 7 passengers on the Artania cruise ship, which is sitting off Fremantle, have tested positive for coronavirus. That ship has no Australian passengers or crew, and WA authorities say only people in a life-threatening medical emergency will be allowed off that ship. The federal government has lifted restrictions on hairdressers, barbers, scrapping the rule that haircuts would need to be less than 30 minutes. And on the global front, the number of confirmed cases will likely hit 500,000 in the next 24 hours. There have been more deaths in Spain now than in China. More than 700 people died yesterday alone in Spain. Millions of Americans will soon receive cheques in the mail after politicians reached a deal on the biggest economic rescue package in US history. And Prince Charles, the 71-year-old heir to the British throne, has tested positive for coronavirus. It's understood his symptoms are mild. Buckingham Palace says the Queen is in good health. OK, let's go to the detail of some of those issues now. So Victoria has recorded its first deaths from coronavirus. Reporter James Hancock joins us now from Melbourne. James, good day. So what's been made public about these cases?
Well, look, Joe, the grim news was delivered by the state's Chief Health Officer, Dr Brett Sutton, on radio this morning. He said that the 2 men aged in their 70s died overnight. They're the first deaths to be recorded in Victoria from coronavirus. He said that their deaths weren't unexpected, considering what we've seen overseas and the mounting death toll there. Now, their deaths bring the national death toll from coronavirus to 11. It follows another death, the death of a 68-year-old man from Toowoomba, west of Brisbane. He died yesterday. He got off a cruise ship in Sydney last week. He spent time in intensive care and he died yesterday. His family is in isolation. Now, in that case, Queensland Health says that that man had a serious existing medical condition. While the death toll is rising in Australia, so too the number of confirmed cases. So in Victoria now, there's been 520 confirmed cases of coronavirus. That's up 54 on yesterday. But New South Wales is still in the lead. 1,219 cases of coronavirus in that state, up 190 cases overnight. So while the death toll continues to grow, also the number of confirmed coronavirus cases.
And James, what's happening with the police force there in Victoria?
Yeah, Victoria Police has revealed that about 200 officers are in quarantine due to coronavirus. It says that a range of measures have been put in place to protect the officers who are still at work. That includes additional cleaning of police stations and patrol cars. Also, it says it's taking very seriously face masks and hand sanitizer. The State's Police Association would like to see the government move from a state of emergency to declaring a state of disaster. It says that that would give police more powers to impose social isolation and also crack down on any mass gatherings that we might see. This morning here in central Melbourne, Joe, it is very quiet on the street. Just a few people out and about a handful of people on the trams as they're going through the Bourke Street Mall here. So it seems that most people are taking the advice of health authorities and staying home if they can to help flatten that curve that we've heard so much about.
And James, has that been really noticeable just in the last 48 hours, the decrease in the number of people out and about?
It certainly seems to be that way. I mean, at this time of day in Melbourne, normally it would be very busy here in the Bourke Street Mall. Yesterday around town, from my observations, it seemed to be very quiet from where I was yesterday. Here in the Bourke Street Mall, it seems to be even quieter. Most people, it appears that they are heeding that message from authorities. They are staying home and they are only travelling into the city if they really need to. It's particularly noticeable on public transport. There have been a lot of trams that have gone by here through the Bourke Street Mall this morning, and just a few people, probably about 5 people on each tram. So it seems that people are keeping away. Presumably they are at home, washing their hands and following the advice from authorities to try to limit the spread of coronavirus.
Okay, James Hancock reporting there in Melbourne. And health authorities in New South Wales have confirmed 190 new coronavirus infections, bringing the state's total to 1,219. Reporter Lily Mayers joins us now from the State Emergency Operations Centre. Lily, good morning. So take us through these numbers in New South Wales.
Good morning, Joe. Well, the Premier says they were able to announce today that there has been a decrease in the last 24 hours. We've had 190 new cases recorded in the last 24 hours, and though that is a lot, there were 212 new cases recorded in the previous 24 hours. So the Premier was happy to see a decrease, but she certainly wasn't optimistic that we are seeing a slowing in the curve. The Premier and the Chief Health Officers say they're expecting Australians returning from overseas in coming in the coming days, and so they could boost our numbers once again. The Premier says if there isn't a dramatic reduction in cases, that there will be new, tougher lockdown measures introduced and that the public should be braced for it. Here's a little of what she had to say.
If we don't see things shifting in the numbers because of those actions, New South Wales will have to go further. And I think everybody appreciates that. But I'm saying no need to panic. Supermarkets and essential things will always be available for people to obtain. But if things haven't shifted because of the actions we took earlier in the week, and actions which I'm very pleased we took at that time, we will have to go further. And I just want everyone to be prepared for that.
New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian speaking there just in the last hour or so in Sydney. And Lily, just take us through what's happened with the cruise ship situation in New South Wales. It's been a particular problem area, and what's happening on that front?
Well, following the controversy surrounding the Ruby Princess cruise ship, the state government has said no cruise ships can dock in New South Wales, and they are now working with the federal government. The Premier says there's possibly thousands of people on at least a dozen ships sitting out in the sea. They're not able to come into shore. That includes both crew and passengers, and she apologised to the families affected and the people who are having to stay out there. But until, she says, the federal government has worked with the state government to resolve new guidelines surrounding cruise ships and the coronavirus, that those ships would have to stay out there. And she said the state government would be working with the federal government on those new guidelines, but couldn't give a time frame on when they would be finalised.
Okay, Lily Mayers reporting there from Sydney. Now, new measures to try to curb the spread of coronavirus have been wound back in Australia. The Prime Minister announced, well, it's just kind of one aspect. The Prime Minister announced specific rules around hairdressers and funerals, but Scott Morrison has now issued a statement saying some of the restrictions are being lifted. Political reporter Stephanie Boys joins us now from Canberra. Steph, g'day. So take us through what was announced and what has now changed.
Good morning, Joe. Well, there were supposed to be a number of new rules introduced from today, including a number of businesses having to close their doors. That is going ahead. However, when it comes to hairdressers and barber shops, there are now changes. Initially, what the deal was that they could only have people coming into their stores for 30 minutes. So appointments had to be below 30 minutes in order for hairdressers and barber shops to stay open. However, the Prime Minister has released a statement this morning. He said that he's spoken with state and territory leaders, and in light of feedback, they've decided to change this. So now there are no restrictions on hairdressers and barbers about how long they can have customers in the store for. However, they are asked to introduce and make sure they abide by those social distancing measures, so 4 square metres per person in the shop. The other change that's been announced this morning is funerals. We heard that there is a restriction. Only 10 people are allowed per funeral, but now it will be up to the discretion of states and territories to decide whether that figure can be lifted in some circumstances, and we understand it would only be by a few people.
Okay. Now take us through what's happened with the testing regime as well.
So initially, the only people that could get tested are those that had symptoms and had been overseas in the past 14 days, or those that had been in direct contact with a person that had tested positive for coronavirus. And there have been a number of calls for the testing regime to be expanded, and that is now happening. There's quite a list as to who is now eligible for testing if you've got symptoms, and then you're on this list as well, you can get tested. So that includes aged care workers, all health workers, if you live or work in an area where there's a cluster of coronavirus cases, and then also if you are in an aged care facility, if you're in a boarding house, in a detention centre or a correctional facility, if there are 2 people that test positive and you have symptoms, you are then allowed to get a test. What is interesting to note though, Joe, is the federal government says it is up to states and territories whether they want to expand this criteria even further to include more people. But that is obviously dependent on how many testing kits there are.
And through this crisis, Steph, we've heard from a number of Australians who've been overseas and trying to get back in Australia, but it's really difficult. What's the latest on that from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade?
So there's about 3,000 Australians on 30 cruise ships across the world. The DFAT hotline has taken more than 18,000 calls for help since the 18th of March. So that just shows you the desperation, obviously, of Australians really wanting to get home before this coronavirus crisis gets even worse. Now, the Foreign Affairs Minister, Marise Payne, has been speaking with the media this morning. She says ambassadors are providing support where possible, but they are finding that there are restrictions that stop them from even helping to an extent because every country is putting in certain measures to try and curb the spread of coronavirus. So the government has been calling on commercial operators to help. They're aware that cruise ships are organising some charters, and the Foreign Affairs Minister said in particular in Peru, where there are a number of Aussies, there's a private travel company organising a charter plane out of there hopefully this week.
In some places, of course, it is much more difficult to leave, as I've said, and I think a good case in point is Peru. At the moment, we are working very closely with an Australian business called Chimu Travel in providing them assurances from government so that they can assist Australians to leave. That is, they are talks that are underway. There are a number of other areas where I'm also concerned. Nepal, Kathmandu in particular. South Africa has recently closed its flights down too. So they're discussions that we're having with international airlines and with travel businesses like Chimu in Peru in particular.
And as this situation continues to evolve, the state and territory leaders will meet with the Prime Minister again tomorrow. That's another National Cabinet meeting to be held, and expect more details announced either tomorrow or on Saturday morning.
Okay, Stephanie Boys reporting there from Canberra.